once we've set out the sort of the scene of where things are and why we need to upscale traditional conservation, we are also going to start to talk a little bit about how rewilding has emerged. And the way we'll do that is we'll introduce some examples from across the world. And kind of the idea behind this is that although they all of the examples that we're going to provide emerged kind of in isolation, they shared some common thinking. And as scientists and practitioners have sort of understood and studied these practices, they've started to develop this concept of rewilding, and it's actually emerging now, I would say, as a new wave of conservation, a new movement in conservation that is strongly underpinned by a scientific evidence base, although that evidence base is growing and constantly being added to. So although you might have heard and come across the concept of rewilding, and it means lots of different things to different people, I think what's really important is that there is this kind of scientific framework that's emerging that I think is really important for thinking about nature conservation and how we can address some of the challenges that we'll talk about. And what's really important there is that we're not saying it's the only way to address these things. We're saying it's one of many important ways of upscaling traditional forms of conservation. And we'll pick apart that a little bit as we go through the talk. And then finally, we're going to shift from these kind of theories and principles of rewilding to actually look at how rewilding is applied in practice a lot more. And in particular, look at the kind of British landscape of rewilding and just give a little nod to a few of the case studies that are really popular, but talk about how they're adding to this understanding of the scientific sort of principles of rewilding. So why do we need to upscale conservation, traditional conservation? I think the first thing is that we could look at many different data sets and they would all say quite similar things. So this is one data set, which is called the Biodiversity Intactness Index. And essentially the Biodiversity Intactness Index, it uses a form of modeling. So it's looking at the state of the natural world prior to any human modification. And it looks at the distribution and abundance of species that would have occurred in different parts of the world. And it uses that to construct an understanding of what biodiversity would have been like in those locations. And then it uses another model to look at how land use has changed as a result of human interventions, and then models the impacts that has then had on biodiversity. So what you get is a picture of the areas in the world where sort of essentially biodiversity is declining the most, and sort of the redder areas are where we've got really low biodiversity intactness, and the blue areas are where we've got kind of much more intact biomes and ecosystems. And then if we just click through on this slide here, we can see that if we went back into the 1970s and looked at the global picture of biodiversity using the Living Planet Index, we get a very similar message. It shows this is instead of looking at biodiversity intactness, this data set uses the abundance of populations from around 5,230 species, and it shows that the average decline is around 69% during this period of 1970 to 2018. And often we think about the UK as kind of leading the way in nature conservation. We've had some really important organisations doing some really fantastic things. And those are organisations like the Wildlife Trusts, the National Trust, the RSPB. Also, our planning system has been around for a long time with an emphasis on biodiversity. But using some of these measures, using the first measure that I talked about, the Biodiversity Intactness Index, we're actually ranked one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. And that already takes into consideration the fact that biodiversity naturally would be unevenly distributed across the world. So the amount of modification that's occurred in the UK has led to a really significant amount of biodiversity loss. And then if you actually start to look at the global spending on conservation and looking at how much money different countries, different parts of the world are putting into conservation, you notice that the UK is putting a lot of money into our nature conservation. So this is a map here showing the amount, the global conservation spending in US dollars, and we can see that billions of pounds, billions of dollars are put into nature conservation. Globally, 21.5 billion spent annually on nature conservation, and the UK is up there with some of the top spenders. So although we're putting a lot of money into our nature conservation, there is debate. We probably should be putting a lot more in when you compare that to other countries. But the efforts that we're doing are not addressing the crisis that we're in. So we're still in the situation where biodiversity continues to decline despite the spending and the legacy of conservation within our country.
This is the case. If we're spending so much on nature conservation, why isn't it working? What is going wrong? And the explanation that is increasingly being told around why we have been failing in our efforts to try and stop the decline in biodiversity. We've had various different targets. First, it was 2010 globally, then it was 2020 to stop this halt, and none of it is working. We're just seeing actually ever steeper declines in biodiversity. Why is that happening? Well, essentially, the thing that has been brought forward to try and explain this is the fact that we're not actually reacting to the level of biodiversity that we should be trying to protect. Essentially, we're using the wrong baseline. The baseline is the measure that we're trying to kind of restore to or conserve, and we've been using the wrong baseline. And a really good example of this are starlings. So since the 1960s, starling numbers in Great Britain have declined by more than 50%. And that is an enormous loss on many levels. The first is that they were important in provided an important ecosystem service. They eat leather jackets, which most gardeners will be very happy about if they're in the garden. But also they provide very different benefits in different ways. So this is a cartoon that alludes to this. One of the challenges that we're facing with regard to this shifting baseline syndrome, as it's been referred to. So this is a cartoon taken in 1966 when there were still a lot more starlings, and a couple are sat there watching the murmurations that we've just been watching and saying, wow, aren't they just amazing? Those murmurations blow my mind. And we fast forward to the present, and different couple are sat there watching them, and they're thinking, are those starlings? They can just about identify the species, but they can't remember what it's called when they actually perform those amazing visual spectacles in the sky. And then if we fast forward a significant point in time, I'm not sure why that's cut off, but I think it's 2030 something in the cartoon, and the couple are just about recognizing that they're birds. And the point that this cartoon is trying to get at is that actually, as the species decline and disappear, the critical thing that we're losing is the knowledge of what biodiversity is. And that is a critical aspect in many ways. And one of those is actually understanding the knowledge that we have. So this is a quote that's actually from my mum, who grew up in Hull, and she spoke about. We asked the question: if you could bring back any aspect of nature to show me, what would that you feel is diminished over your lifetime, what would you like to bring back? And the thing that my mum spoke about, which we thought would resonate with this group, is the commonness of the wildflowers when she was a child, and it wasn't just the visual spectacle and the pleasure of seeing those wildflowers, but also that she had the knowledge of what those flowers are. And her granny, my granny, her mum, would teach her all the common names. And she just feels that not only are the wildflowers declining, but also the knowledge of the common species and the ability of people to be able to identify what different wildflowers are. And so this can really be credited actually to Joe's son, Rowan, who I think was about 4 at the time when he came up with this idea. And essentially, we put this question: can you think of a particular aspect of nature that you feel has disappeared or diminished from a landscape in your lifetime that you'd like to bring back to show me? And we put this to our students. And it's been the most amazing experience really that they have engaged in, and we've had some really lovely examples of this shifting baselines, that people are aware that nature is diminishing over time. And that sharing of knowledge is really important, because actually it starts to actually overcome or address the shifting baseline syndrome, where we're actually starting to communicate that we recognise what that loss is. And we absolutely invite you, if that triggers any thoughts or ideas that you've had when we've been talking about that question, do feel free to post them in the chat, because it's an ever-growing data set. So if you're happy to share some of your thoughts and ideas, we'd love to see them in the chat, and we can definitely have a look at those if we've got time at the end of the talk. So this idea of shifting baseline syndrome essentially recognises that we have been working to the wrong. We recognise that we're not seeing the true picture of what nature is diminishing, and that lack of ecological knowledge is critical. If we can use an example to try and demonstrate this, we are going to travel in time and space. So we're going to jump into the TARDIS for a few minutes, and we're actually going to travel over to South America, to Brazil, 199 years from now. And in Brazil, they are working frantically to try and conserve some of the bird species that exist in this ecosystem. They are doing lots of different measures to try and conserve these bird species, but they're diminishing. So why 199 years from now would these species be diminishing from this lovely palm oil plantation? Well, of course, that's because we know when we look at this landscape that it shouldn't be a palm oil plantation, and those shouldn't be the species that are just clinging on in that landscape. The actual pristine ecosystem that should actually be there, of course, is the tropical rainforest, which has been cut down and replaced by the palm forest. And I should highlight that this isn't a CGI image, that is a genuine image that shows the very hard boundary between tropical rainforest and palm oil plantation. And this might seem like a bit of a silly example, but essentially what it's showing is that we can very clearly look at a palm oil plantation and we understand what the baseline is, what it should actually be. And we can recognize that if we're trying to conserve the species in that palm oil plantation, it's never going to work, because they're not meant to be in a palm oil plantation. They're the species that are clinging on. But the problem is that in our landscapes, we have much less ability to see what the baseline should be. So if you go to the Peak District, the North York Moors, the Lake District, various other upland landscapes in the UK, you might find lots of people recreating very happily in upland, heather moorland or conifer plantations. And if you ask them, were they enjoying experience in nature? Did they like the species that they'd seen? Did they feel that they were being exposed to important nature? They would absolutely say, yes, that's wonderful. And most people would not recognise that actually the nature that should be there has been diminished. Or if you ask them what the natural baseline should be, they may struggle to give you an answer. But importantly, it's not just about the individual, and everything we've spoken about up until this point really is the individual perspective. But the problem is that this has become an institutionalised problem. So that actually all of the conservation policies and laws that we've been developing over the last over 100 years have actually been trying to conserve species in the ecosystems they are currently in. So we have been working essentially to the wrong baseline, and all of our policies are developed around this institutionalized shifting baseline syndrome, where our policies are literally trying to protect species in the ecosystems that they were never actually evolved or adapted to exist in. And if you're wondering, well, what is the likely impact that we may have had as a species, as a human species, on the ecosystem? This is a brilliant study that was undertaken in really large forests in France. It was undertaken in a small scale and then carried out on a much larger scale. And it looks at a forest where there is clear evidence around the trees of Roman occupation. But what is truly amazing from this case study is that actually the archaeological and soil evidence shows that after Roman occupation, there has actually been no other human use of the landscape since that time. So the Romans abandoned it so it was settled, it was used for agriculture, they ploughed the land, they applied fertilizer onto the land. And then when the Roman civilization fell apart and they moved away, it has not been used since. The trees grew up around it, and there has been no real human occupation since that time. And yet, And yet, bearing in mind this is nearly 2,000 years ago, the study looked at the impact of that settlement on and floristic diversity, on the floral diversity in these landscapes. And the graph at the bottom essentially shows that with increasing distance from the settlement, the species richness got higher. And in the places where agriculture was carried out, there is still a significant impact, a negative impact on the diversity of different plant species. And so that shows that over 2,000 years, the footprint of human existence still reigns and has a significant impact on biodiversity. So we can start to understand the scale at which we may be trying to operate in terms of the temporal scale that we may have had an impact on biodiversity.
And that also raises these kind of quite difficult questions about, well, what would a natural baseline look like in Europe, given that sheep farming practices go back hundreds and hundreds of years, and other forms of agriculture. You know, we've been manipulating the landscape for a really long time. And there's an important kind of point to make about, well, why is it important to think about when, what period of time we should go back to? And this was something that was often considered in ecology early on. And a lot of the kind of early thinkers, whether it was kind of the foresters of Germany, who would talk about how if we abandoned any form of agricultural land, or we abandoned land in 100 years, it would be covered in forest. So that was a really famous quote from von Cotter, who spoke about the importance of human modification within the landscape to enhance biodiversity. And these early ideas were quite simple. You know, if you leave a field, what will happen? It will eventually scrub up, and then you'll get, over time, the development of what was called a closed canopy woodland. And this idea led to kind of a more formalized theory within ecology by somebody called Frederick Clements. And he talked about what he called the high forest theory in his book, In Plant Succession. And the idea was that succession is a process that occurs in a linear fashion. So you start off with exposed rocks, then you get lichen and mosses colonizing, then annual weeds, perennial weeds and grasses, and then shrubs. And then you get kind of more established shrubs and more pioneer trees. And then over time, you get a closed canopy woodland. So without human intervention, the closed canopy woodland would be the dominant state. And this was later taken forward by other thinkers like Tansley, who sort of formalized this even more and talked about things like primary and secondary succession. The idea that primary succession is essentially this that I've just described to you there. Secondary succession might occur if we started to stop managing a bit of grassland, and over time shrubs and woodland would form. So you've already got the soil base, and the vegetation is already established. So all of this kind of pointed to this idea that the closed canopy woodland is the baseline for an undisturbed nature in temperate zones of Europe. And this was an idea that dominated ecological thinking for a really, really long time and got formalized within textbooks. People debated it, but it was often part of our kind of cultural consciousness about what nature would be like without people. And a classic quote you might hear people talking about, if it wasn't for people, the woodlands that would have stretched across the UK from Land's End to John O'Groats, a squirrel would have been able to travel across the canopy without touching the floor. This idea of a kind of a closed canopy woodland. And within that, there was a bit of a debate as to at what point in time did people start to manipulate woodlands and open them up. And that's a debate that I won't get into now, but some really interesting work by a Danish ecologist called Iversen talked a little bit about the really influential work that happened in the really early periods of the Neolithic, And actually, for a really long time, people assumed that it was kind of later on when tools started to advance that woodland clearances happened at scale. But what Iverson talks about using things like pollen analysis and charcoal analysis, but also doing some really quite extreme experimental archaeology, was that actually it was much before these periods. It was like in the Stone Age when people were really starting to shape woodlands. And there's a really nice account of this in a book by somebody called Sophie Yeo. She talks about nature's ghosts, and she talks about this debate really nicely. And she talks about how what they did for this experiment was essentially mimic, using the tools that they could find from old museums, mimic the actual disturbance regimes that were occurring within these quite primitive settlements to show how possible it was. And that's the study there. So the idea goes then that you have a closed canopy woodland. People have opened up that woodland, and then in turn, this has created the kinds of biodiversity that we cherish today. And some really early thinkers talk about this and have written about this. And there's a really nice quote by Ellenberg, which I think is on this slide as well, talking about how Central Europe would have been this kind of monotonous wooded landscape. And if mankind hadn't created the kind of colourful mosaic of fields and heathlands and haylands and pasture, they wouldn't be there. And even within this writing, you can see that Ellenberg draws you in, because who really wants that kind of dark, monotonous woodland? Probably not many people, but who wants the colourful mosaic of fields and heathlands and haylands and pastures? Well, everybody would, because of the way that's been phrased. But also it kind of associates these open habitats with the work of man, and not just any type of man, the farmer in particular. And so it positions farming in this quite important way as halting those kinds of successional processes. So reducing the kind of linear succession that Clements talked about, and actually opening up the landscape. Now, Anna, I think you were going to talk around this slide a little bit more as well.
Yeah, just to highlight that. So for a significant period, for 2 centuries, vegetation succession has been argued as the dominant natural process that ultimately would end in this equilibrium state where forests persisted, and that to get diversity and variety, essentially it was humans that created that. And actually you can still go to sites. A good example is going to lowland heathland sites, where you may hear the site manager, or you may even see on the boards that this is a man-made habitat. Lowland heathland is a man-made habitat, and the problem is that many of the examples just don't really back that up. So what we've actually got are really complex evolutionary relationships that have evolved between our flowering plants and the species that live off those. So at the top, we've got a very specialized wildflower that is adapted to chalk downland, and a type of shield bug that will only survive on that one plant, Theseum humifosum. And that evolutionary period that evolutionary process, has gone on for millennia. Okay, humans arrived out of Africa about 80,000 years ago. We evolved as a species about 200,000 years ago. This relationship dates back before that. Another one at the bottom, perhaps my favorite, is the relationship between Collina vulgaris and the wonderful silver-studded blue butterfly, whose caterpillars only eat Collina vulgaris and a couple of the other ericoids, but only feed on heather species. And not only is that a very specialized relationship that must predate humans' intervention. So heathland is not a man-made habitat, but also the complex relationships that then flow on from that. So the fact that the caterpillar sings to attract in black ants, and it then feeds them sugary liquids, so they carry the caterpillar into their nest so that they can feed their termites with their young with the sugary liquid, and then the caterpillar voraciously eats the ant young. So it tricks them into it, and they carry on kind of feeding it and let it exist. And this kind of complex web of relationships that occur between wildflowers, the arthropods that exist on them, and then the enormous web of life that flows on from that. There is absolutely no question about the fact that the European landscapes were not a consistent wildwood until humans intervened. All of the evidence of our amazing wildflower and animal existences definitely show that that is not the case. Over to you, Joe. Have I lost Joe?
Yeah, sorry about that. I just was on mute and I didn't realize. Yeah, so within that kind of space, there was a really important person who started to develop ideas about an alternative theory around what our natural baseline would have looked like. And this was somebody called Frans Vera. And Frans Vera's work really emerged out of some observations in the Netherlands in a site called the Oostvaardersplassen. And before the 1980s, this area was essentially a reclaimed bit of wetland, and the land was initially part of the sea, and it was reclaimed. And the idea was that this was going to be one of many examples of a reclamation project where agricultural land would be sort of new agricultural land would be available and industrial land would be available. And the area was kind of formally designed for this purpose. But then it was really visible that this was not good quality farmland. And also there was an economic crash in the area that led to the industrial land not being developed in the way that it was intended to be developed. And while this sort of land abandonment occurred, lots of quite interesting things started to happen. So I think if you just click the next slide, we might get a bit of movement from these geese here, Anna, just to keep us going. But what happened is that we got quite a large populations of grey-lag geese that started to breed in the area. And what Frans Vera and his colleagues observed was that the combined effect of their grazing, along with the dynamics of the changing water table, prevented the wetlands from being scrubbed up and following that kind of linear process of succession. And what was quite interesting is that these animals were starting to maintain the conditions that they required. So up until this kind of thinking, there was often this assumption that you needed to get the habitats right first before you brought the animals in, particularly with birds. But what Frans Vera showed was, and started to debate, was this idea that actually there's this really interesting dynamic process between animals actually driving the kinds of processes that they require in the landscape. And this led to kind of a more formalized experiment. So the Dutch government began to appreciate the amount of diversity in species that were naturally colonizing and gave the area nature reserve status in 1983. And the aim of this was all around trying to restore a natural landscape. And it was actually, there was a movement to actually grant a little bit of an experimental status around this project. So the project sought to recreate natural processes that were once present before humans significantly intervened. So the aim wasn't necessarily to just manage the area for biodiversity. It was also to actually make this a self-sustaining landscape and bringing back the grazing animals that would have once been in the landscape. So things like primitive cattle or het cattle, which would have been a substitute for the wild aurochs. And the wild horses, red deer, were introduced into the area. And so the idea was to try and mimic this kind of grazing cycle that Frans Vera had started to understand was occurring just from his early observations of the geese recolonizing the area. And over the years, it became incredibly controversial. There were lots of reasons for this. So one of the kind of key issues was that actually, as vegetation changes, populations can change. And because they had tried to create a kind of a wild landscape where people didn't intervene, the idea was that the actual vegetation would then control the numbers of grazing animals. And so this then led to lots of kind of issues around animal welfare, because you'd have these large grazing animals that were essentially starving in the landscape. So there was a real concern around the animal welfare around this. And Franz Vera would argue that actually you need to let these dynamics play out, because that will then drive more biodiversity in the area. You'll get new life from the death of those grazing animals. But then you had another another critical argument that was actually that the landscape wasn't creating this mosaic of different habitats. It was actually looking quite overgrazed. So a lot of people argued that for a long time, the landscape wasn't working on two major issues, one from a welfare perspective, but also it didn't prove Franz Vera's theory correct. So you got lots of public sort of groups and animal welfare groups raising concerns, ethical concerns around the treatment of animals in the area. You can see images of people throwing hay bales over the fences of the site to try and save and rescue the animals. So often people see this as a kind of a failure in rewilding. And they see that as a failure because there wasn't enough space for the animals to naturally move around. And critically, there weren't the carnivores in the system to actually help control their population.
So whilst all of this was going on in Europe, at a fairly similar time, arguably slightly later, there was a slightly different focus going on in the US. And this revolved around the 3 Cs. So they were looking particularly at carnivores and the role of carnivores in the landscape. And for those carnivores to survive successfully, they were arguing that they needed core areas and that they needed corridors to connect them. So that's the 3 Cs. And Dave Foreman and Soulé and Noss came up with this term, rewilding. So rewilding is often credited as coming out of North America, and they did indeed develop the term rewilding. But actually, in many ways, the kind of thinking around trying to go back to earlier baseline was actually coming out of Europe a little bit earlier, albeit that they focused on a different trophic level. They were looking at herbivores. So in the US, they were thinking particularly about the ability of grizzly bears, of grey wolves, black bears, bobcats, to be able to move around and to influence and have an impact on the ecosystem. And the critical aspect of this was an emerging theory that spoke about the importance of trophic cascades. So if we think about the classic ecosystem food web or trophic levels within the food web, we know that we've got the plants at the bottom, the autotrophs, and then we've got the heterotrophs, the things that are eating the plants. And then we start to have the carnivores that eat the things that eat the plants. And the problem that they proposed is that once that missing top tier had gone, it creates an imbalance in the system so that we have too many herbivores that are then influencing the vegetation in a negative way. Very much what was playing out firsthand in Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands. And what they suggested is that if we put in that top level of the ecosystem back in, then it would have a cascading effect on all of the other trophic levels, not necessarily every single species, but it would have knock-on influences on the really complex myriad web of life that actually humans have very little understanding of. And we have very little understanding of it, partly because it's so complex, but also because it is so changed, so degraded, and actually we've lost so many components of that tapestry of life. We've pulled at the threads of different species until the tapestry is nothing really other than a kind of woven mess of strings on the floor rather than anything like a rich tapestry that it used to be. And undoubtedly, they identified, which was already fairly well recognised in conservation science, that some species have a much greater significant effect on the ecosystem than others. And they argued that principal to that was this importance of apex predators, that they were keystone species. They had knock-on impacts on the rest of the species, and their absence had ripple effects that were influencing the rest of the ecosystem. And this is, again, a really simplified model to try and show some of those connections, but it is incredibly simplified. And actually, we're only just starting to understand how the complex web of life can work, so that two species that may never actually physically interact may have direct implications for each other. And until we put those ecosystem engineers, those keystone species back into the system, we can't actually appreciate the true complexity of the web of life. And that is never more true, actually, than from our flowering plants and understanding the complex relationship they have with the animal species that exist around them.
And from that work, there was kind of an argument then that we needed to think about reintroducing animals back for their particularly carnivores, for their disproportionate role that they play in driving some of the missing processes, such as trophic cascades. And around this sort of time, just over a decade afterwards, there was a debate around, well, hang on, what point in time do we go back to? So a group of follow-on ecologists and environmental activists, some of those involved in that earlier movement of the 3Cs, also made a point around Pleistocene rewilding. Now, this is probably the most extreme form of rewilding that you can get. But the idea of Pleistocene rewilding came out of some work that was developing in the 80s. So there's a reprint of this book by Martin here on the right from 2005, but it was a much earlier publication, the original one, around the 80s. And even before that, actually, Martin's work was really influential. So this book, really predates that 2005 publication of it. That's just one of the issues. But the key thesis behind this was the idea that humans had a significant impact on ecosystems really early on. So even in the early stages in which they left Africa. So the argument previously was that there were major environmental changes that occurred during this period, such as climate change, and then in turn vegetation change, and that this led to the disappearance of megafauna. And that was kind of how often people think about the loss of megafauna. So when we talk about megafauna, we're talking about, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, really, really large animals that had a really important role in terms of some of those trophic cascades that Anna just talked about with the wolf. But what Martin actually talked about was actually that there was compelling evidence that actually it might have not been this kind of overchill hypothesis where it was sort of climatic changes that drove vegetation change that drove megafaunal decline, to actually it being the early hunter-gatherers that actually drove these extinctions, what was later called the overkill hypothesis. So the idea behind this is still emerging and quite debated, but overall there is a pretty strong argument now that this overkill hypothesis at least contributed significantly to the massive decline in megafauna. So when we started at the start and we talked about how the impacts of humans extend a really long period of time, probably the earliest impact that we had is the loss of many of our megafauna. And the idea of Pleistocene rewilding was that we needed to sort of globalize the conservation efforts for protecting the current megafauna that we have. So we've got a really disproportionate distribution of megafauna, and the countries that do have megafauna, particular parts of Africa, have to live alongside these animals, whereas other parts of the world don't. And what these authors argued was that actually it would be possible to reinstate some of the processes of those missing animals by translocating. This was quite a radical suggestion, translocating animals from national parks in parts of Africa over to North America to allow them to perform the roles that they would have played within the ecosystem. And in turn, this would globalize conservation efforts because it would ease the pressure on these really, really sort of fragmented landscapes where we currently have megafauna. And this was largely seen as kind of a thought experiment. And, it's kind of crazy, when you mention this kind of thing, people instantly think, well, you can't be serious about translocating elephants from one part of the world to another to put them into a totally alien environment and just see what happens. And yeah, that is basically how the ecological community took this. But it did trigger this really important debate about nativeness and functionality. So one of the key things that came out of this early work was that actually, if we don't have the native animals left in our ecosystems that performed really important roles, is there an opportunity of trying to recreate those processes using other techniques? And some of those might be using proxies for sort of alternate animals that perform similar roles within the ecosystem. And so that's a kind of an interesting part of the puzzle, really, is these megafauna. And I wanted to point out some work that was done, and it came out, and it's a really incredible piece of work by somebody called Dr. Christopher Sandham at the University of Sussex. And what he did was he tried to look at the evidence that remained around different points in time. So there are lots of ways of doing what we call paleoecology, where you try and look at evidence that is still within the landscape that will help us reconstruct what the landscape would have looked like at different points in time. And for a long time, pollen analysis was one of the key things, where you can take a core of some kind of sediment and then look at the different layers within the sediment, look at what pollen you can see, the distribution of that pollen within your samples, the abundance of that pollen within your samples, and use that as a bit of a method of reconstructing what the vegetation would look like. But what this work was doing was actually using beetles. So beetles are particularly good for doing paleoecology because you often find them in very specialized areas. So you get beetles that prefer different environmental conditions, open areas, closed areas, wooded areas, areas with high herbivore densities because of the dunging behavior. So beetles are really useful for being able to reconstruct the past, looking at their fossil records. And what this piece of work did is it looked at different points in our history to see what our vegetation would have looked like in the UK. And probably the most interesting period in terms of the beetle records that was found was the last interglacial. So this is 125,000 years ago. So what's quite interesting about this period of time, this is when the climate was not that dissimilar to how it is today, actually probably slightly warmer, probably similar to a climate that we're going to be moving into as a result of climate change. It was also before humans had arrived in Britain. So what's really interesting within this record is that many of the plants and animals that we're trying to conserve today within our landscapes, within our kind of ideal landscape that we pictured previously as a man-made landscape and a cultural landscape, many of those species that Anna talked about right at the start there, these are actually evolved under these conditions because of the role that these mega herbivores would have played. So you'd have had things like the straight-tusked elephant, the narrow-nosed rhino, and the giant deer. The giant deer would have had this incredible wingspan that would have been really impacting the vegetation. Just being able to move through the landscape would have been incredibly difficult with antlers like that. And they would have had this really important role in the vegetation. And what the work of Chris Sandham and his team did was actually show that the beetle records would indicate that this was a much more open landscape. But what this work also did, it also demonstrated the importance of shifting baseline syndrome, because Franz Vera's work actually argued that in the early Holocene, we would have had a much more open landscape. Actually, this piece of work suggested that actually would have been much more wooded. So Franz Vera's theory and idea probably didn't play out in the time when he was originally thinking it would. It was probably a correct theory, but you needed to go way further back in time to the last interglacial, when you'd have had these large animals roaming around the landscape, creating these disturbance events and shaping the vegetation and the biodiversity that you'd see there. So what's really critical about this example is that it shows how you can use the past to inform the future, thinking about how we might look into the future and address this issue of shifting baseline syndrome.
So as these different scientific theories were emerging, there was a growing coalescence, I guess it's fair to say, around trying to identify exactly what rewilding was, and the principles that underpinned it. And these three principles were from a really kind of landmark study that was published in the Science Journal, one of the most eminent journals, nature journals there is. And they suggested these three components that probably underpinned most rewilding projects. The first was the importance of trophic complexity, that we had these different trophic scales represented, that we needed to recognise the importance of stochastic or random disturbances events, and that those were actually critical in creating this counter to vegetation succession, that actually animals in the landscape were rebutting and causing this chaos, as it were, within the landscape that created the opportunity for diversity. And for that to be achieved, it was vital that plants and animals could disperse through the landscape without interruption. And essentially, if we think about how that plays out, then we can think in terms of the different kind of levels of ecological complexity, so more biodiversity, and the amount of anthropogenic influence, and how the degree with which we're actually intervening or shaping what is going on within the landscapes. And that allowed us to start to position the different types of rewilding within that spectrum in terms of high ecological complexity and high levels of anthropogenic influence versus the other two ends of those spectrums. We can see that practical and theoretical examples of rewilding were starting to emerge. So in the last few minutes, we're going to try and explore some examples of that in relation to some British examples.
So yeah, I mean, the first thing to note is that all of what we've talked about was there are small examples of it playing out, and I guess the movement is growing rapidly, so there are more examples, but it's still few and far between. At the same time, another form of rewilding is occurring, which is massive land abandonment. So if you look across Europe, so a piece of work here that used a model called the Clue model, looked at the amount of land that was being released from agriculture across Europe, and you see these massive areas being released from agriculture, massive areas of land abandonment. And the impacts of that are quite varied. So I think if you have a look here, there's a couple of studies that we've highlighted that in some cases you can see this is quite a negative thing. It has a potential negative consequence on landscape heterogeneity. So you might get a more homogeneous landscape, much more wooded landscape, which in turn can lead to an increase in wildfire risk. You also get issues around local land abandonment having impacts on livelihoods and cultural values as well. But then there are also positive benefits associated with this as well in the literature. And these, I would say, are getting reported more and more commonly now. So things like the increase in woodland cover and the associated species around that, the potential for water quality and water cycle benefits, natural flood management by retaining more water higher ups in, say, upland landscapes, and the reduction of soil erosion. And what I would say is that generally speaking, there are loads of different examples of this. And some of them, in fact, most of them on the scale are happening outside of human control and outside of planning. So we've got a whole range of different examples here just to show that there are different degrees of intentionality within this kind of rewilding that's playing out. So you've got things like the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where, obviously really tragic disaster has led to the rewilding of an area that now is actually very rich in biodiversity and supports a real great diversity in a whole range of different species. And then you've got other examples in cities like Detroit. You've got examples in areas of northern Portugal where you've got farmlands being abandoned. And then you've got examples like Wild Ennerdale in the UK, where it's actually a conscious decision between land managers to allow natural processes to occur. And actually, these natural processes are very open-ended. So we've got a few examples here of the River Liza, which is an area within the Lake District National Park where they've tried to remove any features that would obstruct the way in which this river would flow and allow for vegetation to change naturally. But what's quite interesting here is that, as you can see, you've got a lot of non-native species coming up as well. And what they're doing in this landscape is actually being quite tolerant of these non-native species. So if you speak to the managers in charge there, they're more interested in kind of structural diversity and the supporting the potential habitats that these kind of more novel ecosystems are providing than actually trying to recreate a past pristine nature where it would have just been broadleaf woodlands as opposed to areas of Sitka spruce. So this is quite an interesting example where you've got a rewilding project in the UK that's gaining a lot of momentum, but they're quite open-ended about the baseline that they're actually trying to set for nature.
And whilst these examples have been looking at kind of a passive approach to rewilding, where essentially all that humans do is step back and they don't really intervene, they just let natural processes play out. So, for example, in Wild Ennerdale, there hasn't been a huge amount of reintroduction of native species. There is some livestock grazing, but generally fairly passive. Quite a different example is what's going on the Knepp estate down in West Sussex, which was formerly managed as an intensive farm. So they worked the Sussex clay as hard as they possibly could to try and make productive land. And essentially, it was staring down the barrel of bankruptcy. And so Charlie Burrell, who was the estate owner, had met Franz Vera and decided that they were going to try and enact some of the principles of the wood pasture kind of model that Franz Vera held was true. So they ripped down all the internal fencing pretty much wholesale. So the only thing that was left was the perimeter fence. They then added proxies for the wild herbivores that we'd lost in the Holocene since the last ice age. They also did some active interventions like rewiggling the river. So they took out the canalisation that had been put in the Industrial Revolution. And essentially, they then stepped back. So they allowed kind of non-goal oriented processes. They did not set targets for individual species. They just basically sat back and watched what happened. And what happened is probably one of the most famous examples, best examples of nature conservation in the UK, one of the best stories that there is. So the photo, the landscape photo shows the difference in terms of the transition in the landscape, lots of scrub occurring, but also enough herbivores to mean that it wasn't succeeding to full woodland. There was this battle between succession and herbivory. But the thing that was truly amazing was the way in which it shattered the baselines that we'd had. So the purple emperor butterfly is in all your books, if you've got butterfly books, as a woodland species, as are the turtle dove and the nightingale. But what this grand experiment actually started to show was that it was not, these are not woodland species. These are species that actually thrive in scrub. So the purple emperor was not found at all on the Knepp estate when the project started. It now has the biggest colony of purple emperors in Britain. And the same is true of turtle dove and nightingales. They have absolutely resurged on this site. But also lots of examples of plants that have just re-emerged from wallows that wild boar have created, not wild boar, the Tamworth pigs that are the proxy for the wild boar have created on the estate, species that have not been recorded anywhere else in West Sussex. some amazing examples of orchids resurging. So just across all the spectrum that nature has resurged through this active process of rewilding. And while we haven't got examples of trophic rewilding in the UK, so we haven't had the bravery to put in apex predators, indeed we have negotiated for about 20 years about whether species like beaver are going to are they going to be allowed to come back? That happened very recently in terms of England on the 5th of March being allowed, but we haven't gone down the road really of discussing in any great depth whether predators can come back. I say that there is starting to be a project working called Links to Scotland, which is looking at the opportunity for the Eurasian lynx to be reintroduced, but there are still very many barriers, including the National Farmers Union and indeed the SNP leader declaring that this would not be allowed and that they would never see the lynx reintroduction. And so in response to that, there has been this response from the public or from conservationists. Some people somewhere out there are taking it upon themselves to reintroduce species in the UK to try and see whether they can bring this back. It has happened successfully for the beaver, the wild boar, and the goshawk. So the goshawk was extinct in Britain and came back in the latter part of the 20th century through illegal releases. Same is true of the wild boar. Probably mostly escapees from wild boar farms, but also some intentional releases. And of course, the beaver appeared on the River Otter in Devon and survived a stay of execution and was allowed leave to remain. And indeed, finally, in March this year, they've been allowed to come back. So there is this example of species taking, of people taking the law into their own hands. And one of the things that we need to think about when we're thinking about how we enact rewilding is the degree of intervention and management that we need to put into play. So actually we can take many of these principles and apply them in almost any setting or example. And critical to that is thinking about the degree with which how that applies at different levels of scale. So the argument goes is that we can actually rewild a window box on a city apartment balcony. But if we do that, we have to intervene significantly. And the level of management and intervention is the axis going up and down. The bigger the area is of which we're starting to enact rewilding, the less intervention we can have. So if we're heading out to the Yellowstone and the Okavango Delta in Africa, the scale at which those projects are playing out means that actually we can allow natural processes to operate without humans needing to intervene. But that is not to undermine the fact that actually we can implement many rewilding principles on much smaller scales, but it will require humans essentially acting as proxies for some of the actions that the missing animals would perform. If we're thinking about how we can actually communicate these principles, well, actually, John Lawton did this hugely effectively, not around rewilding specifically, but when he spoke in response to the government's call to look at the state of nature and what needed to happen. And he came up with these 4 amazing principles: that sites needed to be bigger because size matters in nature. The bigger the area, the more important it is. They needed to be better quality. So they needed to be managed to increase biodiversity. There needed to be physically more of them within the landscape. We just needed to have more areas left for nature, and critically that those needed to be joined up. And those 4 principles really are things that, as I say, not originally developed for rewilding, although John Lawton is undoubtedly now an ardent advocate of rewilding and he sits on the board at NEC. But those 4 principles are critical and are aspects that can be applied in almost any setting, whether it is the Okavango Delta in Africa, right down to a 1-acre site in Britain. And we can think about how we can apply those principles in different schemes and areas. So to conclude, sorry, I know we've gone slightly over, but we started slightly late, so I think we're technically within the hour. To summarise, essentially rewilding has occurred as a restorative approach to try and address the impending, indeed the existing biodiversity crisis that we find ourselves in. It is arguably the most important proposal that has come forward that can really radically alter the shift in baselines that we've seen, that can really focus on how we can change kind of the whole ecological paradigm that we're in, and refocus what has always been a very narrow approach on specific species and habitats to think much more about the processes that would occur. This was actually developed out of projects that were applied on the ground in practice in the Netherlands and in the USA, and have now actually started to develop into really advanced thinking in academia around the science that underpins these. And undoubtedly, a lot of what we're talking about is controversial and difficult. The Britain is a brilliant example of looking at the challenges that we have at living alongside animals. We struggle to cope with mesopredators like foxes and badgers in our landscapes, and we certainly don't want to even consider in many instances what it would be like to live cheek by jowl with wolves or lynx. But hey, you only have to cross the British Channel and people are doing it. So there are many different political and cultural tensions around these debates, but ones that I think we really need to have if that we're going to address the biodiversity crisis. And I think the final slide, Joe, do you want to just talk about this?
Yeah, so this is just a really kind of unashamable plug about the work that me and Anna are doing. So this is, I just wanted to talk about a degree that I teach into, which is the BSc in Climate Sustainability and Environmental Management here at Sheffield Hallam. And rewilding, I think, is becoming a really critical element of this degree. So this degree isn't just about ecology, it's got an ecological pathway through it. And I suppose it highlights the fact that rewilding is a key part of our thinking going forward about global sustainability and how we can sort of, actually address some of the situations that we're in, but it has to be done alongside other things as well. So that was a key thing that I wanted to mention there. And if anyone was interested in the degree that we offer or any information about wider work we do on rewilding in Sheffield at Hallam, I'd be I'd really welcome a conversation around that.
Shameless plug on my part. First masters in the world that has rewilding in the title. So this is something really excited that we've brought forward at Manchester. It's going to take its first intake in September. The MSc in Nature Recovery, Restoration and Rewilding. And essentially what we're trying to do is change the narrative around what people are going out into the world to do, to really try and make a difference in terms of getting people that are skilled and knowledgeable about how we can do this. And critical to that is not just as an ecological focused degree, but very much the social science of this, about how we change hearts and minds about the biodiversity crisis and what we should do about it.